Hello DebConf, hopefully everybody's feeling well today. Today I'm going to be talking to you about branch2repo, which is a little thing that I've written that fits into the salsa continuous integration pipeline stuff and lets you build things like debian-installer. That's what I've done it for. I think the first thing I should do really is explain how debian-installer gets built normally and how branch2repo fits into that process to make it a bit easier so that people that don't know the way it works can do it anyway. I'm going to do this in the style of a Khan Academy video, which means that the screen's just about to go blank. Please do not adjust your set. To describe how one might change something in debian-installer, I think first we ought to have a quick look at how things are normally done in debian-installer. So we start from source, of course, and we have a bunch of packages, and they get built. I'm going to use, so green I'm using for things that are sort of release versions, and I'll use other colours for branches later on. So they build into multiple and so on. So there are, I think, a total of about 850 udebs that get built in Debian at the moment. So that's udebs. So a bunch of udebs, and somehow that gets turned into something that you can boot as debian-installer and put on a machine that you want to install Debian on. Let's have a machine that we want to install Debian on up here. Okay, so we have that, and we got some sort of bootable media like a CD or something, and that's got DI on it. The simplest thing that you can put on there is just a kernel and an initrd, and then expect to get everything else off the network. So let's do that one, because that's actually what I'm doing at the moment. And so the thing that we're trying to build is called mini ISO, and that's built by building, so boring stuff over here. It's built by debian-installer. So debian-installer is actually the name of one of the repositories in the debian-installer cloud of repositories, and what it does is it downloads udebs normally from the normal Debian repository. So let's have a Debian repository for doing that from. Let's do that. So we'll have the udebs here, will be on the repository, and it will grab those and make them into something. It doesn't actually, it doesn't only make the mini ISO. What it makes it normally is initrds, and it makes different flavors of those initrds. It makes one like this for doing a network install, and it has one for the CD install, which is when you've made a bigger CD and all the udebs and things you want are on the CD. Then this one knows how to mount the CD, or well, find where the CD might be, because it might be on a USB stick, and then mount it and get the udebs off there. And there's one for hard drives as well, HD, which that handles the SD drive boots as well, because they get treated like a hard drive. So if you build debian-installer by default, it does all of this and generates loads of stuff, most of which you can't actually boot because it needs some help. The CD one needs Debian CD to turn it into a CD. But it does do this one. It takes the netinst initrd and a kernel that matches it, and it sticks it onto the smallest bootable thing that you can make, which is a mini ISO. And these, what else do we need? Yeah, so at some point someone has uploaded, is that a build? I don't know. I guess when they feel it's ready they do an upload of that, just for completeness, because that's how the various versions of things got onto the repository. Okay, so that's the normal way of things for Debian installer. If you want to change something, then you're going to take a copy of one of these. Let's have something else. I'll just say we've got one called X, and there's something you want to change about that. So put that in there. And at the moment, when you install Debian installer with this, there's probably not a copy of X actually on the mini ISO, because this has only got the things to get it booted. So this is, if this is one of the later menus, it won't be on the mini ISO. But what happens is that when it is booted, the running version of DI on here, should we label that as DI? Let's have DI running on here. It goes off and gets, it grabs a copy of X, grabs a copy of X, and it runs its post inst, which is how things happen in DI mostly, and you get to see a prompt saying, hello, how would you like X configured? Okay, and we want to be able to change that so that instead of it being a green X, the released version of the X package, we want to fork that and come up with a version of our own. And then we want to build our own version, and we want to do that, and then somehow we want it to ask our version of the question instead, or install our version of something onto the hard drive. So if we imagine that we obviously don't want to release this because we haven't tested it yet, but if we imagine that we had another repository that we could upload things to, and we could put this onto there, then if we could persuade DI to talk to that, then it could get the the updated version of X on there, and then that would go on there. That's what branch2repo does. So we have branch2repo, branch2repo. So if we contemplate what's going on here for a moment, you can obviously build things on your local laptop or whatever, or you can get Salsa set up so that it does continuous integration, and whenever you push something into a new version into the repository here, it automatically builds the thing there, and then you can upload the source and build daemons will build things for you. So this bit can be automated fairly easily. If instead of using the salsa-ci team's pipeline for doing this, you include branch2repo, which is basically the same thing with an extra bit on the end, then the extra bit on the end, what that does is it nudges the branch2repo repository via a trigger. So it starts building something in this repository because you nudged something over here. And what it tells branch2repo that the thing that started this off is this version of the X repository. So this version could be in your own namespace, so you could have forked it, and it's probably going to be in a separate branch from the master branch or whatever is the default. So that's what is represented by this pink, is the fact that it's probably in a different namespace and a different branch. And when branch2repo gets one of these triggers, what it does is it builds, it creates, well, it either uses or creates a new branch in a private repository that it has, and it creates a list of all the things that have triggered it from that branch. So the pink branch, and it says X, we'll put that on the list. Good. And then, so it's doing this, and then it uses this list to build a repository. So it goes and gets this, it gets this and puts it in there because it's on the list. So we'll put that in there. Then if it wasn't for the fact that this netinst can't actually deal with multiple repositories, what we'd like to do is have this overlay the X that we've got in here. So we can make sure that this has got a higher version than that, because Salsa cheerfully adds a bit extra on the end of the version. It's a bit of a shame if someone uploads to the repository while you're doing it, but you can always, we could always abuse epochs if that's becomes a problem. The reason that it can't do multiple repositories is if we look at, let's pretend that this is Anna. Anna is an actual debian-installer udeb, and it's one of the things that can't handle multiple repositories. So if we were to fork that, which is what I've done, and make it another, apply a patch that's available to make it a bit cleverer, then in the configuration of this for branch2repo we can set a variable which says we need a particular version of Anna as well in order for our tests to work, and that means that this trigger will have a record of that, and branch2repo will add that to the list, and then when it builds this it will add that to the list. Once it's done this, the next thing it does actually is that it triggers debian-installer, and it tells debian-installer things like I was triggered by X, and I've just built, let's call this number 1, I've just built this repo, here's the URL, and you can use that. Debian-installer uses sources lists as one might normally expect, so adding another repository is no problem, and that will ensure that all of these initRDs end up with a copy of the new Anna in them, which means that this will have the new Anna in it, and so will this, and now we can get it to grab stuff from over here as well, including our pink X, and then there. So if you look at the grey bits here, they can all be done by CI, continuous integration. That being the case, all you need to do is push things at this branch, and then you can go and make yourself a cup of tea, and while you're doing it, it'll build a new version of X, it will push it in, it will nudge branch2repo, branch2repo will update its list, it will create a new repository, it will tell debian-installer to make a mini ISO, and it will generate a mini ISO for you. Of course, the thing that prompted me to do this in the first place is that debian-installer is actually quite complicated in the way that the dependencies of things work, and normally when you make a change to something, you have to make a change to something else to make your change actually worthwhile. So if you have a branch of Y as well, and you want it in here, all you need to do is include the branch2repo YAML file in this one as well, and it will, when it's built, give this a nudge and say, oi, I'm pink Y. So you've given these both the same branch name, and that means that they both get onto this list. And then when you're building Y, and it doesn't matter which order you do this in really, then when it subsequently builds the repository, because this is now got all three things in the list, it will end up with a repository. I guess this should be 2 or 3 or whatever. Let's make that 2. Then, because this reference is being passed through, the reference from this particular build actually ends up in this ISO. So this time it'll be 2, this will be 2 here, and that means that you'll get the repository that's got all the bits in it. And so whatever Y is meant to do, it'll end up doing it. Hopefully that's given you a sort of overview of why I've put this together and how it's useful in doing installer testing. Well, having made the whole thing seem much more complicated than it probably is, I'm now going to try and demonstrate that what it does is make life rather simpler, with a demonstration of fixing a bug which is actually a feature request in debian-installer. So here we go. So this is a bug asking for the ability to switch off rather than reboot at the end of an install, which is a reasonable feature. It was asked for in 2018, and if you look through the bug, everybody agreed that it's a good idea. Since then, not really much happened. When the bug was reported, Cyril pointed out that the thing that you need to fix this is probably in finish install here. Okay, so the fix is fairly obvious. It's not that difficult to do, but these sort of things, we've got lots of bugs like this in debian-installer, and it's nobody's fault in particular, because there's just not enough effort being applied to debian-installer. And that's my hope is that with branch2repo I can convince people other than the people that already have touched debian-installer to give it a go. It's not that difficult. So let's have a look at what you actually have to do. So this is the debian-installer Teams namespace finish install package, and so the first thing you want to do is fork it. So here it is in my namespace, so I can confidently play around with it without doing any harm to debian-installer proper. So the first thing I need to do when I fork this is actually enable branch2repo, because at the moment this isn't in the master branches. Hopefully we'll put this in soon after release, but I don't want to touch anything right now. So this is all you need to do to enable branch2repo. You have this include, which brings in the salsa-ci pipeline and the extra bits for branch2repo. And then in this case, because finish install is late in the process, that isn't something that gets included into mini ISOs and things like that. So we need to tell branch2repo that there's some extra projects that we need, and we need net retriever here, net retriever, because that doesn't currently understand how to have multiple repositories. And we also need Anna. Did I mention during the previous bit, Anna is named, it's called Anna because it stands for Anna is not nearly apt. So it's not nearly as good as apt, but it does the same job for debian-installer as apt does for Debian. Looking at the branches that we've got in this repository of mine, we see that we have the master branch with this branch2repo enablement commit, and I've also created a branch for the bug. So let's have a look at that. So as Cyril mentioned, here we have a template which for a note that says reboot in progress, and the fix that I came up with that's meant to implement this feature is to change that to a select called what next and default to rebooting, so that we're doing the old behavior, and then it turns out that finish install has a bunch of little scripts that do various things, and the one that presents you with the final message is called 20 final message because it's a .d directory. And there are some precedable variables called debian-installer exit halt and debian-installer exit power off. As you can highlight that, for instance, that one. So you could actually, I mean, this is one of the reasons why this bug hasn't been fixed, is because you can precede around it, and then the urgency for fixing the bug goes away, and there's not enough people working on Debian-installer, as I mentioned, so things that really break stuff get fixed, and things that would be nice to have but there's nobody actually in agony because of them, they fall by the wayside and they get left in our bug tracker forever, which is a real shame, especially when something is fairly trivial to fix like this is. It didn't take me more than about half an hour to write this, and so we changed the way that the prompts are presented slightly, and we have to add an extra case statement that says whether the user wanted to reboot or halt or power off, and depending on which of those it is, it sets the precedable values to make the result happen. This seemed like the lightest touch way of fixing this. So here it is, that's the thing, and I pushed it, and what happened? So something is wrong with Lintian. This, of course, isn't. Let's have a closer look at the pipeline. So if I click on the pipeline over here, then we see that we have the normal salsa-ci pipeline running here. Everything up to this point, up to the end of the publish, that's all part of salsa-ci's pipeline. It's nothing to do with me. They've done a great job of making it really easy to build stuff. So if you haven't come across salsa-ci's, the salsa-ci team's pipeline thing, and you haven't been doing continuous integration, do that. I really recommend it. Anyway, here we find that the Lintian script, which I got for free just by including it from the pipeline as part of branch2repo. So looking into the log of the Lintian job, if we look for things that have this error, then we find shell script fails syntax check. Now this is pretty typical for me. I'm quite often sloppy when I'm typing. So let's have a look at what I did wrong. So can you spot it? Here we are. This is the bit with the error in it, and well, we didn't really need this, did we? Let's fix that and commit it and see what happens. And we get a green tick. So everything worked. Now let's have a look into that pipeline and see what branch2repo is doing for us. This is just normal building of a Debian repository in the salsa-ci team pipeline. This bit you might not have seen before. This aptly job is normally disabled, and if you enable it, then what it does is take the outputs of the build and make an apt repository out of it. So we've now got an apt repository that's sort of private to this bit of the pipeline and contains the udebs from this build. Then the next bit that you won't have seen before is branch2repo. Or this is this is the tail end of the YAML that we've included, causes a trigger that goes off to branch2repo, and this is a multi-project pipeline. So that's another thing you might not have seen before, is pipelines which trigger other builds in other repositories. So what this does is it triggers a build in branch2repo, and it builds a repository out of all the things on the list of all the repositories that have triggered it using the same branch, which as the complicated slides showed, hopefully. So you ought to have a handle on that. If you haven't, I guess you're going to have to ask me about it in the questions afterwards. Once it's done that, it bridges again, it does another trigger to debian-installer, the script that actually builds the mini ISO. If this is conditional, so if it's in a master branch, or if it's actually in the default branch, so if someone changes what the default branch's name is, it still works. If it's in the default branch, then it does this as a manual job, which means that you get a play button here and it doesn't actually do it, which means that if we have these branch2repo includes in all of our packages, when something like a language update happens to 20 repositories, we don't get 20 jobs all running trying to build mini ISOs all at the same time, unless some human comes along and goes click and decides it's a good idea, which after you've done all the uploads you might decide to click it on the last one just to see if it still works. Anyway, having got past that little wrinkle, because this is not a master or a default branch but a feature branch, it automatically goes on and builds a mini ISO because you probably want to test it. If people tell me that they would rather it was always manual, we can have a variable for setting that or something. I'm sure it's pretty simple-minded at the moment. There's lots of opportunities to make it more complicated later. debian-installer builds a mini ISO for us using the repository that branch2repo built for us, and then it does another trigger, and this is a little repository called OpenQA link. So I'll be talking about OpenQA in a couple of days. I won't go into it in much depth here. So we go into the next repository, and we have a job called OpenQA bridge, which is basically there's a sort of 4-line shell script being run in a Docker. And what it does is it takes the details of the mini ISO we built and a couple of links back to these pages, so that from the OpenQA you can link backwards as well, and it pushes that into OpenQA using the OpenQA API. That generates a load of jobs in OpenQA for testing the ISO, and then it uses the GitLab API to create this list of external jobs, which it starts them out in this paused state, or this pending state. For some reason these never came out of pending, despite the fact that the jobs did succeed. But one of the jobs failed. I wonder why that is. Well, another thing that I want to point out is you can make these triggers dependent. So you could make it so that because this failed, then this trigger would have failed, and because this trigger failed, the next trigger failed, and you could do that all the way back to the beginning and have it so that a failing test in OpenQA causes a failed pipeline in finish install. But some of the tests are a bit unreliable, and this sort of thing is currently happening, so I don't want to do that. Maybe one day, if this becomes reliable enough so that you can be sure something is really wrong when it says it's wrong, we can do that. But for now, I'd rather that if you want to find out whether it really worked, you need to click through this pipeline. So let's see what's going on here with this broken job. Well, it was trying to install GNOME for us, so it does a full Debian install run through and ends up with a GNOME login prompt. The thing that failed, let's have a look at the thing that failed. It seems not to have recognised this screen. Shall we see what it is then? Well, how about that? It says reboot, power off, halt. So it can't recognise the fact that we've got a new screen that's never existed before. I think that's a successful demo. We're not quite done, of course, because one needs to test whether these two options actually work, and it would be quite nice to be able to demonstrate that, so I'll probably add tests to OpenQA to explore those code paths. But having done so, I'll have something that I can point to in a merge request, and that merge request will then be much easier to accept because we've actually got a demonstration that the code works. So I think this shows that it should be easier to get changes into debian-installer if we adopt an approach like this. Okay, I think we're pretty much done with this. I could go into details about how branch2repo works, but it's actually pretty simple. It's a couple of YAML files. The thing that makes it complicated is the way it interacts with the GitLab CI. If you want to see how it does what it does, just have a look at the branch2repo repository. If people come up with questions after this, or questions that don't fit into the question and answers, then I'll write up answers on the README or something on that repository. Most of what you've seen actually isn't even done by branch2repo. It's being done by the salsa-ci pipeline, which you can find here, and if you've not come across it, I really recommend you go and have a go. It makes life really easy for building all sorts of bits in Debian. This talk was about branch2repo. If you've got questions about OpenQA, then I'm doing a talk in a couple of days which should cover those questions, hopefully, and if not, you can try the question and answers at the end of that. And if you need to get in touch with me, you can email me at phil@hands.com, and I would be very pleased to get questions about how to use this stuff and extra features that you might need and things like that. Okay, so let's leave some time for the Q&A.
Now it's time for the questions about branch2repo to Philippines. The first question is, do you have an example salsa repo that applied branch2repo?
Well, there's the example that I included in the talk. There's also apt setup has it set up at the moment, and a couple of other Debian installer things. If you look in repositories under my name, Phil H, there's quite a few examples in there where I've been playing. So yeah, there are several.
The next question is, how about the security when using branch2repo?
Right, so this is taking patches that someone pushed to Salsa and turning them into ISO images. So it's about how much you trust the security of the patch that was pushed, and how much you trust Salsa's infrastructure to actually build what was done. So I wouldn't plan on using these images for anything important or anything that you boot for more than about a minute.
And then we have one more question. Does OpenQA use preceding or some way of controlling mouse clicks?
Well, if you want to know more about that, there's my talk at the same time on Thursday is about that. But it actually uses, you script what you want to do, and it looks for images on the screen, and there's a user interface for defining where it's meant to be looking, and then you can make it click parts of the screen, or you can make it type things. You can also make it Well, I'm doing my talk from Thursday, so go and look at the talk from Thursday and ask me questions that aren't clear after that. Okay.
That's all the question we had for now.
Okay. Well, I'm very happy to get questions via email as well, and it's all early days yet, so it might change, but yeah, if you're interested, get in touch. And thank you very much.
Now someone's typing another question.
You got another question?
It's coming in right now, being typed. How do you think branch2repo could be integrated into the salsa-ci pipeline?
Okay, so I think some of the things that are in branch2repo could probably fit in there. The bit that probably can't is that at the moment, the way it records what it's meant to be doing is that there's a private Git repository that it creates branches in, and there's a file in there that contains the list of things it's meant to be doing, and it needs to have the key to do that. So when you do the multi-project pipeline, there's a private variable that's holding the token for pushing things into that repository. You probably don't want that in the pipeline. So I think you're going to need something a bit like branch2repo, even if most of its intelligence is ripped out and pushed into the pipeline. I'd like it so that it didn't really do anything except that bit in the branch2repo repository, because that would mean that it's more likely to be maintained in lockstep with the pipeline, and it's almost everything you saw is being done by the pipeline. So if the pipeline changes and breaks branch2repo, then I'll have to fix it. If they're part of the same thing, then hopefully they'll be tested together.
That was all the questions for now.
Okay. Jolly good. Well, hopefully everybody's enjoying DebConf so far, and will enjoy the rest of it. Have fun, everybody.